And welcome back, guys. Finally, I made it. In this video, we're gonna check out the best opening ideas of the FIDE World Cup. It took me countless hours to go through all of the games. I mean, in the World Cup, it's not like a round-robin tournament with 10 players when there are limited games. There were quite a few games, and of course, many different interesting ideas in the opening, which I went through. And here is my selection with my personal favorites. We've got quite a lot of e4, e5 in this video, especially from the white side. There have been quite a few nice ideas in the Spanish, and I think we will also see some Italian. And yeah, let's get right into it. I will post the PGNs if we hit 500 likes, so make sure to pump up the video if you want to see the PGN for that. And let's get right into it. So the first two ideas, actually, which we're going to have a look at, was featured in the match between Niels Grandelius and Pentala Harikrishna. Obviously, you all know that I was a second for Harikrishna for quite some time. Also had the pleasure of working with Grandelius. The three of us actually had a training camp together at some point, which I've also spoken about in a separate video. So it must have been not so easy for them, of course, to play against each other. The match in the end was decided in the tiebreaks in favor of Harikrishna. And we are seeing two games of the tiebreak, with Niels Grandelius having the black pieces against Harikrishna. And in both of them, it was the Italian starting with knight f6. And after d3, Grandelius went for h6. Which is, yeah, nothing new in current times. It's a very flexible move order for black. Sometimes black even goes bishop c5 on the next move, with the point being that if you go for this, then it does give white this option of bishop g5. Also, you have the option, if white goes for those lines with knight c3 here, to go for bishop b4. So there are a couple of upsides, but of course also a couple of downsides. For example, if after c3 black goes for bishop c5, white has immediate ideas to play with b4. But all of that was not Grandelius's idea. He went for g6 here, which is a very uncommon move order because it does allow white immediately to play in the center with d4, which also Harikrishna did. And there are almost no games here, but it turns out that black can actually take on d4, which is quite surprising considering the fact that black is not really developed yet and arguably also created some weaknesses on the king side, but it fully works out because of this funny idea that after e5 you can go for knight h7. And the knight is a little bit strange here, but it can help also with the defense of the king side, and sometimes it can get back into the game via g5 as well. I had a look at this already a couple of months ago and thought it would be very interesting, but didn't have the chance yet to play it myself. And generally, I feel like we're also going to see that in the next idea, that it's possible for black to make a repertoire against the Italian, purely focusing on g6, which is something I didn't really think that it would be possible because of some different move orders, but I think it's doable for the black side to always go for some g6 setups, which, especially if you're a King's Indian player, is quite a cool thing, I would say, because the positions tend to be quite similar with the fianchetto. Also, if you play the Steinitz in the Spanish, those positions tend to be quite similar later on with g6. So, but let's get back to it. In this game, we're going to purely focus on this line with d4. When, as I said, Grandelius took on d4, white played e5. White doesn't have to do that immediately. I think short castle is probably also possible. I would say that knight takes e4, I guess, is not yet a viable option, but after bishop g7, it's most likely going to transpose sooner or later. So e5, knight h7. Harikrishna went short castle, c takes d4 will also transpose to another line. The only independent option, as far as I can see, is the move queen b3, which is the top choice by the computer. But I feel like the line which we're about to see is, first of all, not easy for humans to even find all of that, like starting with queen b3, and even the follow-up leads to a very interesting position. So c takes d4, now knight to a5. Black wins the bishop pair like this, and then black can go into an endgame with the bishop pair. White's idea is to play for the lead in development, and also the pawn on h6 is hanging, but it turns out that black can actually give the pawn on h6 with b6. And if white takes on h6, go bishop b7, and then black has the idea to reroute the knight via f8 to e6 with pressure on the d4 point. And obviously, if you look at this bishop on b7, it has quite a nice time here because it just fully controls this nice diagonal. And also, if you go to some bigger depth, the computer understands that black is going to have sufficient compensation. So after knight h7, short castle was played by Harikrishna, very logical human continuation, bishop g7, c takes d4, short castle. And now it all still looks a little bit clumsy with the knight on h7, but after d6, it turns out that black actually gets sufficient counterplay against white's center. And Harikrishna went for h3. Also taking on d6 doesn't really promise anything much. Black has a couple of different playable options. C takes d6 was my main line. Even bishop g4 is possible here to give the other pawn on c7. Queen takes d6 is also possible, leading to this IQP position with a lot of pressure on the d4 point. But just as an example, c takes d6 with the idea of bishop g4. White goes h3, then a6. Just covering the b5 square, and sooner or later playing for b5, bishop b7. Doesn't seem like really an issue. Black can also later on try to regroup the knight to f5. And yeah, seems like quite a decent position for black. Harikrishna went for h3, and then Grandelius took on e5, traded queens, took on e5 again, and the following position is equal. Rook e1, bishop d7, bishop came to c6. Grandelius later on was even much better, but in the end, the game ended in a draw. So let's move on to the next one, which, as I said earlier, was also played between Harikrishna and Grandelius, but this time Grandelius chose a bit of a different variation. Again, it was the same start with this h6. Harikrishna stick to c3, d6 now. As we saw in the last game there, it was g6, which I believe is quite an interesting option. But in this game, d6, short castle, a6 was played, which is also important for us if we want to play the same line if white plays castle first. And here the issue is we cannot go for this line with g6 because now white didn't commit to c3. And now after d4 it's all a bit different. E takes d4, white can even take knight takes d4. And last time I checked, this was not looking really good for black here. So if we want to build a repertoire here, I would suggest to play the move a6 here anyway, because now at least after c3, d6, we are back into the Grandelius game. Maybe you can also, of course, dabble around with those systems. This is, of course, also quite possible. But I wanted to show this possible move order here as well, that it's possible to get this line via the short castle, but not the one we saw in the previous video with g6. Here, this is not possible. So he went for this line with a6 here. It's quite interesting why a6 first and not g6, because there are quite some similarities. Like after a6, a4 in the game, he went for g6. And it's not fully obvious to me where is exactly the benefit for black in some of the variations. And sometimes it can even look like it would be a benefit for white. But I fully trust in Grandelius's work here, so there must be at least a couple of reasons for the inclusion of a6 and a4. The objective reasoning, I believe, is that here in the game after a6, a4, g6, generally it feels like to me that mostly this immediate d4 push is quite a critical way to handle this. And it seems like here in the knight takes e4, for some reason this inclusion is favoring black, because later on in some endgames this b3 square can be weakened. But I don't really would suggest going into all of that. And even here, I believe that white is a tad bit better, but of course it's holdable. And the most enterprising try still here looks to me just to take on d4 and go for this. White is a bit better here, but I don't think it's like a clear one-way street. For example, if h3, black is already better because of knight takes e4. So white should probably go for something like d5 and then knight e7. I guess knight b4 would run into a5 when this knight on b4 is a bit misplaced and in danger of getting trapped. But still here, black did have some counterplay, like c6 could be one idea. If white goes h3, could even think about g5 and then knight g6, rook e8 with some strange type of Benoni position, just that the pawn is not on c5 but on c7. Computer says that white is a bit better, but as I said, I think that black does have definitely some counterplay on the king side. And yeah, and this is also one reason, like without this inclusion, after the immediate g6, d4, now e takes d4 here, it does seem like this inclusion is would be good for black because the b4 square is weakened, and generally a6 seems like a useful move, and a4 could be weakening in some case, even if we don't use the b4 square. For example, here white did not really have to play for d5, and this was something the computer was giving. Even here, it doesn't seem too bad. Like, it still seems like black should have some counterplay, but computer was saying that white did have a nice advantage here. If you want to play those lines here without inclusion of a6 and a4, this move queen e7 is certainly playable as well. Computers don't like it so much because even sometimes those positions are objectively not fully okay for black, but it does lead to this typical King's Indian play, which in general is obviously not as simple, practically speaking, like it is for the computer. But let's get back to the Grandelius game. He went a6. Now, if white goes bishop b3, well, first of all, knight a5 is kind of a major strategical threat, winning the bishop pair, so white needs to take care of that with either a4 or going back bishop b3. If bishop b3, I don't really see the problems now. After g6, black will play bishop g7 short castle, and then later on, as usual in this structure, black will have some ideas to, for example, go knight h5 followed by f5. Also, knight h7 followed by f5 is sometimes an idea. Even knight d7, with ideas of knight c5. Generally, those positions are great to play for a win, I would say. But Harikrishna went a4, and now g6 was played by Niels. And in the game, Harikrishna went for b4, after which black was doing already quite well, because it's not so simple for white to follow this main Italian plan with rook e1, knight f1, knight g3 here. For example, if white tries that, immediately d5 comes. And actually, this pawn on c3 is quite a big target. Also, bishop d2 could run into knight b6, winning the bishop pair, because if the bishop leaves, d3 will be hanging. After queen b3, bishop e6. Now knight takes c3 is actually a threat, because after queen takes c3, often e4 puts some pressure on this long diagonal. And if bishop d2, rook b8 followed by b5, at least if we can get it, seems quite okay for black. If b5, of course, knight a5 would be an issue for white. In the game, Harikrishna went bishop a3, and here already Grandelius could have gotten quite some nice play with knight h5, knight f4. In the game, he went rook e8, and also this position was quite decent for black. b6 is an important idea, also to bring back the knight via b7 perhaps later on. Later on, the game was ended in Harikrishna's favor, but I think it was quite a good opening outcome for the Swedish number one. The most critical line objectively here is actually queen b3, but I don't think it's such a big issue. Queen e7, now a5 is important, otherwise knight a5 is coming. Bishop g7, rook e1. Here short castle, even knight h7 seemed fairly interesting to me, with the idea of playing knight g5 next. But yeah, this was my main line, short castle. d4 important, otherwise again, if knight d2, knight h5, I think black will have pretty nice counterplay on the king side. So d4 and now knight d7. And yeah, it's not so simple for white now how to protect the center. Probably he should go for bishop e3. If d5, knight to d8 followed by f5 again leads to quite nice King's Indian play. After bishop e3, now we cannot take on d4 and on e4 because of bishop takes h6, which is not good for us. But instead there is this cool idea of b5, which of course strategically speaking is not so great for black, but we are playing for dynamics here. And after en passant, knight takes b6. White should actually not try to keep the bishop pair, because now we get a5 followed by knight b4, then maybe also c5 later on. Instead, knight d2 was the best, and then we can win the bishop pair like this, and our knight is actually going to b5, where it is firmly protected. Still, computer gave a tiny edge for white, but yeah, first of all, they need to find all of that, and secondly, the following position seemed very much playable for black with rook fb8 to come. So I would probably be the most worried about this d4 push here, actually, which on the other hand is quite difficult for white to play if they don't know it. Because it's quite rare that you go for this early d4 in the Italian, because you just a couple of moves earlier played d3, and generally white wants to develop the pieces first and only then go for d4. Anyway, this was the second idea. As I said, it's important for us if we want to build a repertoire accordingly, especially from this move order with short castle, because now it would actually make sense to perhaps go for that. Yeah, of course, d6 would also be possible here. So that's another story which you can definitely also investigate. But let's move on to the next one, which was featured in quite a couple of games. We are still in the e4, e5 territory, but this time from the white side. And now we're going to have a look at a couple of different ideas in the Ruy Lopez. And the first one is this one with bishop takes c6. I've called this the delayed exchange variation because you are losing a couple of, well, one tempo. You're going back a6, bishop a4, and then you're taking on c6, which looks a little bit counterintuitive. But on the contrary to the normal exchange variation, because here black has a couple of ways to stabilize the center, for example, with f6. And generally in those positions, the knight on f6 tends to be a bit misplaced. And often the knight goes to d7 to protect e5 next. And generally the knight would love to be on d4 or on e6 in general, to go to either f4 or to d4. And the center would like to be stabilized with f6. Which here is not so easily achievable for black, to say the very least. In the World Cup here, the move Rook e1 was featured at least in a couple of games. I would also like to mention d3, which funnily enough I played the first time in 2018 in the Austrian Championship back then, and nowadays there are quite a few games here as well. The idea is here to sort of get type of this anti-Berlin with d3. Of course the structure is the same. And yeah, it's sort of to get a game. In my game in the Austrian Championship, I played it like this, bishop e3. Now my opponent played c5, and I played for this maneuver here, knight d2, then knight c4, f4, and I had a tiny bit of a better position later on. Game ended in a draw in the end. So that's arguably a more positional approach. In the game Rook e1, in the World Cup, Rook e1 was played. For example, it was played in Lodici against Hans Niemann, which, as we all know, Lodici was able to win that match. And it was also played by Idani Puya against Esipenko. Idani, the Iranian grandmaster, put up a very, very good showing against the ultimate third place of the tournament. And I think even won a game here in this specific line. Maybe the game late, yeah, it ended in a draw, but he had a nice position there. So what is the idea of Rook e1 actually? The idea is if white goes back knight d7, we have immediate ideas to play with d4, which is not really the case if we go for d3, then going for d4 would make less sense, but here white is playing for a bit of a slower play. I should also mention that this line was more or less invented. I would say maybe it was also played before, but the first really high-level game which made me notice the line was between Nepomniachtchi and Ding in their World Championship match from 2023. There, Ding played knight d7, and this is how the game went. Bishop f4, knight c5, and now queen to e3. Funnily enough, in the World Cup, also this was played between Maxim Vachier-Lagrave and Vladislav Artemiev. But in this endgame, black had pretty comfortable play overall. Artemiev even went on to win this. So queen e3 is certainly the most critical move here. And in the World Championship match game, bishop g4 followed, when now Nepomniachtchi had a pretty nice opening outcome, but instead knight d6 is the best, forcing back the bishop to g3. And here generally it feels like to me black should go for something like this with f6, then queen e7, and then put the queen to f7. And whenever e5 comes, black can keep everything closed with f5. Of course, the bishop on c8 is still not so great, but later on it can get out with b6, bishop b7, or bishop a6. So the downside of this line is that it's already sort of well known, even though I think you can definitely try it for one or two games as well, because not everyone is super familiar here with all of the details from the black side. But c3 is the idea I want to show you, and it seems to me like it's quite a cool surprise weapon. But before we go to that, I should also briefly mention some of black's other alternatives, including queen d6 and bishop g4. Bishop g4, h3. Now, if black would take on f3, this is exactly what white wants. Now black does not have the bishop pair anymore and is stuck with the bad bishop on e7. Of course, it's still not so bad for for black, but white will try to get the knight to c4, then push g3, h4, and so on, with a very nice long-term pull for white. So bishop h5 is more principled, and here it tends to get quite sharp because white probably should go for this g4. Otherwise, if white plays slowly, then black can consolidate everything. And after g4, black can sacrifice the piece here or sacrifice the pawn like this, which is both possible. I would say that the piece sacrifice is probably a tiny bit more, tiny bit better, objectively speaking, but still here, like, it's just incredibly sharp. White should probably go for this immediate d4 push. After d3 short castle, black is going to push f5 next, which seems quite dangerous. There are very similar lines in the anti-Berlin as well, which you might be familiar with. But here it makes more sense to push d4. E takes d4, now queen d3, stepping out of the pin. And there was a recent game between Petroff and Nisipiano from 2025 where queen d6 was played, but here black did not really have enough compensation. So black needs to follow up very precisely. Obviously, white has to too, because the king is in a bit of danger. But we have the benefit of being able to prepare all of this. c5, knight bd2. Again, if short castle, this is way too slow because of knight e5, followed by f4, when white's king is actually fairly safe. So queen d6 is important. Now c3. And I was just following this one correspondence game here. Take on d4, knight c4. Queen f6, knight c e5. And knight h2 was quite a nice move, trying to untangle, and in the end white was a tiny bit better probably because now it's not so easy for black to actually continue attacking, but instead he's playing for material, and in the end he also has 3 pawns for the piece, which is quite a bit, but the pieces do have their advantages as well. I was following the game until here when I stopped, when it seems like white does have quite some attacking potential, maybe even f4, f5 at the right moment. Yeah, this was the correspondence game. Whelan against Petroff I've followed. Queen d6 is also a good move, which actually was one of my issues here in the line. Knight a3 was recently played between... no, actually I wanted to say that d4 was recently played between Aronian and Gukash. Bishop g4, knight d2. Of course, black cannot take here because of e5 winning the piece, just to note that. Knight d2, and now black should notice queen takes d4, after which, though, black is doing pretty well. Black gains back the queen like this, and in the end even ends up a pawn down, a pawn up. White is going to have sufficient compensation, but not much more than that. Aronian actually lost against Gukash because he did not manage to find full compensation here. Said white should go for bishop b2, and this was the best line, followed by knight a5, but also here it seemed like black is not really risking anything much. There was a game between Colors and Keimer, which inevitably ended in a draw. Another option after queen d6 is knight a3, which I've checked briefly, but yeah, black should go for bishop e6 here. I believe b5 is also possible, but here at least white can get maybe a better version with d4. Bishop e6, queen e2 with the idea of knight c4. This is another area which can be investigated. But black had a couple of interesting options here. Knight d7 is important, knight c4. And probably the best was the game between Erdogmus and Yilmaz, which was queen b4. And the whole point is here that black has queen c5 and then regains the pawn with taking on c2 in the next move. I think it was also possible to play b3 here. So generally there is a bit of flexibility here, but I would say that those lines like queen d6 or even bishop g4 were a bit more of an issue for me than knight d7. But knight d7 is the move which is most likely going to get played, because if black enters this, they will probably realize that queen d6, d4 is not going to be like such an easy line, and if white is prepared, they can run into some danger there. So let's get back to knight d7. As I said, c3 is the line featured in the World Cup. Now, Esipenko in that one game played a5, and after d4 just took and went knight f8. It looks like some sort of preparation. The whole structure reminds me quite a lot about, again, some Berlin variations. Esipenko put the knight to g6. Now d5 was played by Idani, and the following position still felt like white is the one pushing here because of black's inferior pawn structure. Of course, with the bishop pair, black does have some counterplay, but it feels easier to play for white. I feel like c5 should be the critical move. Now d4. And in Hans Niemann's game, Niemann took once and played short castle, but quickly ran into trouble here after knight c3, b5. A4, b4, knight d5, and the following position was not great for black here. An improvement over Lodici's play, bishop f4, is even better than the move d5, which I think was played in their game. Yeah, c takes d4, taking everything is probably the most principal variation, and now short castle. Yeah, it's the whole idea is to take with the queen here, of course, not with the knight, to centralize the queen, and then play knight c3. Another game from the World Cup, I think this was also Idani against Esipenko, went bishop f6, and now an important maneuver here, queen d5, and bringing the queen to the king side, c6, queen h5. And I'm pretty sure that this was Idani's preparation here, because I'm not sure anyone would be able to find queen h3 instead, running into the discovery, but it turns out that white can just step away with the queen. And the following position is surprisingly unpleasant, because white has some play on the dark squares. Rook d1 is coming, then maybe installing the bishop to d6. So yeah, this was another variation I had a look at. c6 probably the best here, and after bishop e3, knight c5, this is one of black's best options here, when the position is probably balanced, but still black needs to find a good way to develop the bishop on c8. Maybe a5 was a good move here. White can slowly try to improve the position. Maybe at some point knight f5 could be an idea, inviting black to take on f5, of course ruining our pawn structure, but it will open up the e-file as well for our pieces. So I feel like there's still some things to be explored in this delayed exchange variation. Of course, rook e1 is probably the more concrete try here. If you want to check out something more positional, definitely make sure to have a look at the move d3 here. All right, let's go to the next one. This is sort of an honorable mention because the line itself is incredibly complex, and I think it's way too much to fully go into this in the video here. It is another line in the Marshall, but this time not bishop takes c6, but instead d3. b5, bishop b3, d6, now a4. Bishop d7, c3, and short castle. This is a position which you can often reach in the Spanish if you play this d3 line. Whoops, that was a misclick. And here the move bishop a2 was played a couple of times recently. Again, this is one of Nepo's ideas against Ding, which he actually did not use in the World Championship match, but later on used against Ding in Vaikanze after the match, and Nepo actually was able to win that game. The idea of bishop a2 is that, well, if white makes a move like knight d2 here, then black typically plays knight a5, and once the bishop moves, then c5. So after bishop a2, the idea is that now if black moves the knight, at least white has b4, and the knight has to go to b7. Funnily enough, I still think that knight a5 is probably the best move here, at least from a practical point, because it does not give white any great attacking play on the king side as in some of the other lines. After b4, knight b7, white should probably take on b5 and go knight a3 with the idea to bring the knight to e3. The position is certainly playable, and the knight on b7 does make a bit of an awkward impression, but if black is precise, he can probably get back the knight with something like queen c8 or queen b8, knight d8, knight e6. But this is not really what most black players do, because it does look a little bit strange to play right into white's idea with knight a5 here. One game from the World Cup was between Kuibokarov and Jan Subeli. Subeli went queen c8, knight bd2, and now bishop d8, which was quite an interesting move. The idea was rook e1, knight e7 to try and bring the knight to g6. Knight f1, but here for some reason he took on a4, after which white was able to regain the pawn and had a pretty nice position. Instead, he should have played knight g6 here, following the plan, and then c5 when the position should be balanced. But that was quite an interesting maneuver here with bishop d8, which is something definitely to remember. Bishop e6 is also possible. White wants to keep the bishops here with bishop b1, b4. And this was a game between Rapport and Esipenko in last year's German Bundesliga. Rapport went for a5, which is possible, but I would say the immediate d4 is quite interesting as well. And also here, if black is precise, they should probably be okay in most of those lines, but yeah, the play is also a little bit strange for white. Like, generally, the bishop a2 would be a line I would probably not play myself, because it's just incredibly complex. There are so many details. But if you really want to put in the work and try to surprise your opponent, it's probably something which can be investigated, because you are trying to leave the common theory quite early on, and you're certainly not allowing black to follow his usual plans. If he is following his usual plan, because this h6, rook e8, bishop f8 is very, very typical in the martial, just preparing rook e8 without allowing knight g5, then white has quite interesting play, especially connected with g4 quite often. In the game between Nepo and Ding, this was also what happened here, g4. And those initiatives on the king side tend to be actually quite dangerous. This was what happened in the Nepo game. Now just king h2 and rook g1, and white did have quite significant pressure on the king side. Bishop f8 is also possible, and this was played in another game between Idani and Esipenko, knight bd2, and Esipenko played bishop e6, take, and Idani actually went for the move g4 here, which again is very interesting, and he won a pretty nice attacking game in under 30 moves. But here the very simple move d4 should also give white the advantage, because black cannot take on e4 due to d5. Knight e7 is also quite logical, was also played in some games in my database, and here the idea was g4. If knight h4, g5 is fine for black, but g4, g5, h4, and now kind of all hell broke loose. There were, I think, 2 correspondence games, and it gets very concrete here. But I think that white is probably the one who is a little bit faster with mobilizing an attack on the king side. For example, bishop h6, knight g5, and then king g2, and white is the one to get rook h1 first. Yeah, this was more of an honorable mention. Anyway, I didn't want to talk about that too much. The main thing was just, if you guys are curious, it's an interesting idea, and you can certainly check it out more, but I would like to focus on some other areas in this video still. Next one is another anti-martial from another game between Grandelius against Harikrishna. And here we have been following the main line of the anti-martial for quite some time, a4, b4. Now d4, I actually had the same line in my encounter against Yu Yi in the second classical game. And after d6, I opted for d takes e5, and he took back d takes e5. Grandelius unleashed quite an interesting idea, the move bishop g5. The funny thing is, we even talked about this briefly, me and him, before the tournament, and he quickly showed me the idea, and I was sort of guessing some or looking for some human reactions, and it was surprisingly difficult for black to come up with something. The computer is screaming with many different alternatives for black, and all are 0-0. But it's a completely fresh move. There are just a handful of games here. And in the game also, Harikrishna was a little bit worse. And it's an interesting and fresh idea. For example, if black goes h6 immediately, this is a more obvious way to go wrong, I would say, because after taking, white will get bishop d5. And this pressure on this diagonal is going to be a bit unpleasant. Here, white should be a bit better. Another possibility is to take on d4. This was one of my first reactions from the black side, knight takes d4, now knight a5. Taking on d4 was surprisingly not so good. I think after c5, this was another one of my suggestions. I think white can go queen d3, and then just knight d2, and black is not really able to break out with d5. Knight a5 should be the best, bishop a2, c5, knight f3, h6, bishop h4. And again, one of my ideas was bishop e6, but here white just gets e5, and black is not able to use the f-file for him in time. So knight h5 is the best. Take on e7, and now white has quite easy play, I would say, with knight d2. Black should go bishop e6, and here white should probably take on e6 and go into a position like this with queen e2 to come c3. Another possibility, if you don't want to give black this play on the f-file, another possibility would go for e5, which is probably a little bit more straightforward here. Bishop g4 was played by Harikrishna. This is probably also the best. Grandelius took on e5, knight bd2. Now knight fd7, took on e7 and h3. And this is one of the other critical positions. And when I first saw this, I also felt like black shouldn't be any worse by just taking on f3, which was also what Harikrishna played. And here, though, he went back bishop e6, which is an interesting move, but after that, both had kind of possible game. I think that that Grandelius was a tad bit better here as well, but later on it quite quickly ended in a draw. What I also thought when I first saw this without an engine, that black can probably just take on f3 here and just put his knight to c5 when the knight on c5 is can never be kicked out, and strategically it should be nice for black. But this is actually not the case, because white will get bishop d5 and bishop c6, and all of a sudden all of black's forces are pretty paralyzed. Rook d1 is coming. White can slowly improve the position, maybe with g3, king g2, h4, and those things. Maybe at the right moment e5 as well. So this is already a bit unpleasant. If black goes for that, he needs to go c6 to avoid bishop d5 and then go knight c5. But now the drawback is that the pawn on d6 is weak. Queen f4, for example, rook a8, and white had e5, some play on the e file. The best here is actually bishop h5, but black now needs to count on g4, bishop g6, knight d4, which looks a bit unpleasant because f4 now is quite a big threat. So black needs to rely on queen f6 to stop f4. And after knight f5, the position is unclear. Both sides have chances. White could have some ideas still to go for f4. And yeah, this is probably black's best, but still it's a playable game at this point. So a very fresh alternative here, apart from all of the other moves that have been tried here. Most of them, of course, d takes e5, bishop g5, nice idea. Let's head on to the next one. We are sticking to the marshal, actually, again, from the white side. So here you will have two ideas. The first one against the main line with b4, and the second one against bishop b7, which now we are seeing a game of Sam Shankland against Daniel Dubov. And this was really a great idea by Shankland, I have to say. After the line bishop b7, d3, d6, he went for the move knight a3, which is very, very rare, but a highly interesting idea in my opinion. And I have to give it to Shankland. He was really well prepared in this tournament. Of course, everyone knows him as a really hard worker, and I really enjoy also a lot of his material. I recently bought his book on rook endgames. I've also checked that out. And yeah, really like his work attitude and many of his opening ideas. Just wanted to say that here briefly. So he played knight a3. Generally in this line, the main move here is probably knight d2. I would say white also has h3, but generally nowadays I feel like knight d2 is probably played in most games. And now black's main idea is knight d7, because the idea is if white goes knight d2, knight d7 works because white doesn't have bishop e3. For example, if you look at h3, now knight d7 is less precise because white has bishop e3. And now black does not get knight c5 here. So here after h3, black would go knight a5, bishop a2, c5, and here there's quite a bit of theory. But after knight bd2, this is possible, knight d7, because white doesn't have bishop e3. And c3, knight c5, here there's quite some theory in this line. I think take here, bishop c2, b4, and it goes on, but black is pretty okay here. I also had this nice novelty against Rasmus Svane after knight f1, knight c5, take on b5, which I played in the European Championship 2023, I believe. I made a separate video on that. I think it was called something like My Best Novelty in the Marshal. If you want some further analysis on this, make sure to check that out. But Shankland played the move knight a3, and now the point is if we compare that. If black goes knight d7, first of all, we could think about bishop e3 here. But it turns out that here it's probably less effective because black has the move knight a5, and here the knight on a3 could sometimes be misplaced. But I believe that Shankland's idea was probably to go for c3, and in this line after knight c5, there's surprisingly a lot of pressure on the b5 pawn later on. Of course, I should mention knight takes b3 is not possible in view of b takes c6 when white is winning material, because if take here, take on b7, and the knight is going to get trapped on a1, and white is winning a lot of material. So a takes b5, and now bishop d5 was, I think, not leading anywhere much here. I was looking at this briefly, but it seems like this typical type of position. Computer was giving a tiny edge for white at first, but I don't really believe in those positions for white that much. The main idea should be bishop e3, which is a bit counterintuitive because you're giving up the bishop pair, but now we see the main benefit of the knight on a3 because the b5 pawn is now under a lot of fire. And in many of the variations, black actually needs to sacrifice it and then try to look for some compensation. I think knight a5 is probably the only way to continue from here on. Otherwise, we can just take on b5. Here we can't, because now the queen gets in a lot of trouble with rook b8 to come. So queen c2 is the idea, and still it's not so easy to defend the pawn. Because c6, for example, would run into b4, trapping the knight on a5. Bishop c6, after that, black is also struggling a bit with his whole coordination. If e takes d4, knight takes d4 could be a problem, or even c takes d4. So the best is bishop a6, b4, knight c6, but now bishop d2 comes, and then c4 is quite a big idea. And after some clicking, of course, black was fine. Like, I was looking at this here, but it didn't look so easy for black. Like b5, bishop c8 is the only tactic you have to rely on, and then to take on a3. And in the end, black is going to be fine because of the bishop pair, but still white is a pawn up. So this is knight d7, probably not the best here. I would say that queen d7, which was played in the game, is still fine by Daniel Dubov. I've also checked knight a5 here, which is still quite logical. Now bishop a2, but now the problem is that black cannot get c5 because the b5 pawn would be hanging, so black would need to go for b4. And the following position seemed quite nice for white, mainly to the reason that black's bishop is already on b7. There are quite similar lines where the bishop is still on c8, when it's not such a big problem for black, because he will get bishop e6 quite quickly. But here, I thought that white will have some nice play with knight h2, queen f3, and then knight g4. At the right moment, we could even, if black doesn't play bishop c6, we could even think about putting the bishop to b5. Also taking on b4 is quite a big idea, because c takes b4 will often give us just the c file nicely with rook c1, and after c takes b4, a takes b4, then we will often get just this passed pawn. But we can still wait flexibly with that. I like knight h2 here, and then white will have pretty nice attacking chances. One of the best moves, surprisingly, is knight d4 here, but I don't think that this is such an easy move to make in practice. After taking, black now has those doubled pawns, but on the other hand, now the knight on a3 tends to be a little bit misplaced, because there's no real way to now put pressure on b5. Obviously, you cannot take because the rook on a1 is hanging. So I looked at a couple of different ideas here, but probably there was nothing better than to regroup the knight at some point. There is also the idea to play c3 at the right point, but generally I feel like if it's possible, I would like to keep the pawns like that, unless we can play c3 and then take back with the knight in a concrete scenario. Like, for example, here after c5, I would go for this, because now we have the d5 square, which we can possibly fight for. And if b4, knight d2, followed by knight g3, still the position is around balance, but first of all, black needs to find knight d4, and also here it definitely goes on. Knight d7 is another possibility with the idea of knight c5, which I felt was quite human. Knight d2, knight c5, and here it's impossible. It's not impossible, but it's important to remember the idea queen g4, just to fully focus on the king side with f4, f5, and so on. Still, objectively speaking, okay for black, but it's a fresh position and they need to find knight d4. Dubov played queen d7, which is still a good move, and now the whole point of the idea, now c4. Still, we cannot take on b5 because a1 is hanging. But c4 is now a nice idea, because if black takes on c4, knight takes c4, of course we have this backward pawn on b2, but on the other hand, we will also get the c file for our pieces, and the c3 square for our bishop. Rook a b8, bishop d2, bishop a8, these seemed like the most natural moves for black. Bishop c3, knight b4, and here I just wanted to show you quite a nice motive, because knight takes d3 now is a threat. Like if h3, for example, black can take here and then b3 is hanging. So there's this nice move a5, with the point that if knight takes d3 is played now, we have this intermediate move bishop a4. Black should not take on c4 in this position. Dubov in the game played knight a5, but here Shankland was a pawn up. Still, black did have some compensation, but after knight takes e5, queen e6, Shankland went back knight f3. Instead, d4 would have given him quite a big advantage. If d takes e4, take here, and the endgame is very pleasant for white. Black has good drawing chances, of course, but white is playing for 2 results. The best move for black here is the move b4, which is not easy for black at all, and even there, black needs to be very precise not to run into any big troubles. Knight c2 now, a5, otherwise we could think about playing a5 ourselves. Knight to e3, and now we are getting ready to play c5 in the next move. So black actually should go knight d8, and now knight e6 is quite a big threat, a big strategical threat, followed by maybe knight c5 or c5. And now c5, black cannot take here because of knight takes e5, so knight e6 should be played. Now c takes d6, c takes d6, and in this position I feel like probably the best practical try is the move h3, because now we are setting up a small positional threat, which is if, for example, black plays the move rook ac8, now we play knight f5, bishop d8, and now bishop e3, and now black is not in time to get bishop b6. Instead, black should now go for bishop d8, because now if knight f5, black will be just in time to play the move bishop b6, when bishop e3 is still possible, but he would get rid of his often passive bishop. So here I check the following. If black finds that, we can go bishop c4 and then b3, followed by rook a2, with ideas to play rook c2 next, maybe at the right moment also bishop b2, or just knight f5 to try and look for some attacking possibilities on the king side. Both parties are not really going to be able to play either d4 or d5, because then the e-pawn is in most cases just going to fall off. Yeah, the problem was we cannot get this bishop e3 immediately, because here black has the move knight g4. That's why I would start with h3 here. You also don't need to play h3 if you don't want to set up this positional threat. You can play bishop c4 immediately and play something like this, which leads to, again, a balanced game. But all of this is not so easy to find for black, I would say. So summary, knight a3 here, very interesting. And with those two ideas, actually you have almost a full repertoire now against the anti-marshal, with both bishop b7 and d4 now covered in those two lines. Now only rook b8 would be missing. If you want a video on that, let me know in the comment section down below. So let's move on to the next one. This is another honorable mention, game between Esipenko and Sam Shankland. Shankland, who often opted for the Philidor defense in this tournament, and it worked out nicely in some of the tiebreaks, was probably quite shocked when Esipenko unleashed this line with b3 here. I had a little bit of a look over this, and overall it's quite interesting, but I'm not sure I would play it myself, honestly. Just a small disclaimer here. Like, it just seems like white does have quite a few interesting ideas against the Philidor. The one main benefit here is that it doesn't lead to the positions which black is mostly familiar with, because as it happened in the game, white's idea is now actually not to play for short castle, but instead to play for queenside castle, and very often to play for a quick g4 in many of the variations, as it actually happened in the game as well. And Esipenko was able to win this game, and I think it was also the one which helped him to advance to the next round. So, interesting line. If you want some analysis on that, I can highly recommend you the Twitter account by Ilya Sirosh, an international master from Estonia, I believe. He did some analysis on this, with some of black's ideas covered as well. For example, d5 was covered there. Definitely check that out if you're curious about the line. Now let's move on to something which is not e4 related. This was between Galavis Medina, I think a Mexican player, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, quite young as well. And Supi Luis Paulo, of course, a very well-known player from Brazil. And it is an idea in the, let me flip the board actually. It is an idea in the same-ish with f3 and bishop a5. Looks completely ridiculous, but I actually saw this the first time already a couple of years ago, because there was a game between Vincent Keimer and Alexander Grishuk in the Tata Steel India Rapid in Kolkata, where I was there with Harikrishna, and I was there for him to help him during the tournament. And obviously I was always following the games there. There was kind of like a player's launch, and immediately went through it and tried to understand the whole idea behind it. And the cool thing was that later on in the evening in the bus, when all of the players were going back, then Grishuk even talked a little bit about some of the ideas. And he also mentioned that white's best move is probably the move rook b1, which was also played in this game by Galavis. It looks like some beginners are playing chess against each other here. Like, this is really what is modern chess nowadays. If you would have played this not even many years ago, people would just laugh at you. But nowadays you can make those things work with the engine. The idea behind it is actually not so ridiculous, because after bishop a5, if white goes for the move e4, this is surely the most logical continuation here, then black counters in the center with the move d5. This was also played between Keimer and Grishuk, and if white is not careful here, it can actually backfire quite quickly for him too. Take on d5, e5, knight fd7, and then black counters in the center with c5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop e3. I didn't check this here, but I think that bishop e2 could run into this trick here. Take on d4, knight takes e5. This is something, this tactical trick also exists in the French defense quite often. And if take on e5, then queen h4 check, winning back the knight on d4. So Keimer played bishop e3. Now Grishuk took on d4, short castle. And yeah, the bishop on a5 is also not worse than on b4 at the very least. Because sometimes you also have ideas to go with the bishop to b6 to put pressure on the d4 point. Keimer played bishop e5, which is still the most challenging move, and now queen h4 check. This is the whole idea. g3, queen h3, still hindering white from having short castle. And Vincent now played queen d2, after which knight b6, bishop f1, queen h5 gave black quite a good position already with some ideas of knight c4, maybe knight a4. Vincent played b3, but now f6 would have given Grishuk already a large advantage. He played rook e8, after which the game was unclear again. In the end, he anyway managed to win. The most critical line here is knight takes c6, b takes c6, bishop takes c6. Good luck for white finding all of that. Queen g2, queen takes d5, queen takes b2, queen takes a5. And in the very end, white is down an exchange for a pawn, but does have the bishop here. And the position is completely unclear. If you want to play this, I think it should be enough here. Like, I really don't think that white players are going to be so familiar with all of that. Rook c1, rook b4 was important. Queen takes a7, knight b8. This was the only line I really checked here, with the idea of bishop a6 next. These were some of only moves which black had to find here, like rook b4 and knight b8. But yeah, good luck for white finding all of that. I don't think this is so likely. Bishop e2 is another very logical move, arguably more logical than bishop b5. Bishop h4, queen h4 check, g3, and here black already had two playable options. Queen h6 is interesting, hindering white from castling short because of knight takes e5. Queen h3 is the move which has mostly been played in practice. Bishop f1, queen h6 here. Now even a better version. So I would probably stick to queen h3 because bishop f1 is such a logical move here. I think there was something better for white, but I believe bishop f1 is going to be played in many of the games. And now we have a better version than to the immediate queen h6. And yeah, this was one line which I looked at here with nice play on the ducks, on the light squares with knight e4, knight e3 coming quickly. So let's focus on other moves. Rook b1 is one thing. One other thing, of course, is a3, which also looks logical. But now the idea is we go for c5. And if white goes for d5 here, then we have one of the main lines just with the inclusion of a3 and bishop a5. And from what I can understand here, if that favors someone, it's probably black. One good example for that I will show you in a second. So short castle, e4, d6. For example, if knight to e2, take on d5, b5, knight g3 and c4. And if we would imagine the position with the bishop on b4, I could imagine that a4 could be quite unpleasant here, because then we don't have b4. Like here, a4 I don't think should be so great for white because of b4. So I think this is one of the main differences with this inclusion. Bishop e3 is another logical move, and then we get a pretty standard Benoni position, which is just around equal. Bishop d3 was also possible here, and here I did not fully dive deep into those same positions without inclusion of a3 and bishop a5, but it seemed like one interesting approach for black was to go for some ideas with knight h5 here. Also, the immediate knight h5 is quite interesting, putting up some threats with queen h4 check, or also f5, for example, if knight e2, f5 is coming. Now let's go back to the move rook b1, which was played in the game. And here c6 was played by Supi Luis Paulo, which is definitely the best move in the position. Computer also gives knight c6, but I don't think this makes a lot of sense, because now white goes a3 and we have to take on c3. And funnily enough, there is the exact same line here with knight c6, f3. Just in the line we just saw, white has an extra rook b1, which obviously is incredibly useful for white. So c6 has to be the only idea. And now if white goes for b4, bishop c7, e4, white does have a lot of space, but black does have some counter chances in the center with e5. Those positions certainly have to be investigated a little bit further. But this is sort of like a start for me and for you guys. And overall, it does certainly seem playable for black. If e4, probably the most natural move, which was also played in the game, then black should remember d6. In the game, Supi probably mixed up or didn't remember and played d5. And now it's just a strategical disaster for black. Even c5 would have been great when black just doesn't have any space whatsoever, and all of the counterplay with f6 and a5 is just not coming in time. In the game, this was played, and also here white has a large advantage. So after e4, we need to play d6. And now it really reminds me of some King's Indian same-ish, just that the bishop is on a5. If you like the same-ish King's Indian for black, then this is certainly something which you will love, because even objectively speaking, it's probably a better version than to the normal same-ish, even though it's still quite critical. White's best is probably g4, followed by knight g3. And in those positions, white should be a tad bit better. So you should certainly check it out a little bit more and try to understand what is the best way for black to find sufficient counterplay. Because if white is in time to just push the pawns on the king side, then it could quickly become bad news for black. So this is something that should be checked a bit further if you want to play this on the higher level. But of course, like rook b1 already is not the most obvious move for white. If you're playing this, certainly e4 is the move that is going to be played in most of the games, I believe. All right, let's move on to another honorable mention, which is another game by Harikrishna from the white side. I guess most of you guys have seen that game against Najdorf. It was the famous idea in the Petroff with d4, knight takes e4, d takes e5, and now bishop c5. d5 is the more solid variation here for black, but bishop c5 aims to draw the game by force more or less, because here it tends to get very forcing. Bishop c4 now is the main move when the main line continues like this. And yeah, it's sort of a memory contest here. Typically white is the one who is asking the questions, and black needs to remember or find the right way to not get checkmated. If he does, it's going to end in move repetition quite often. But Harikrishna played the line queen d5. And I'll tell you a funny story. We actually checked this together 3 years ago. Bit more than that already, like 3.5 years ago, for the FIDE Grand Prix, where he was playing in 2022. We prepared this together. He, surprisingly to me, though, said in an interview that he already checked this 9 years ago. When we had a look at this together, I don't recall him mentioning that, but I then also spoke with Markus Rager, my compatriot from Austria, who was also the second of Harikrishna, and he did recall having this with him together at some moment. So after the move queen d5, bishop takes f2 was played, king e2, f5, knight c3, c6. This is all forcing. And now, of course, this incredible queen sacrifice. I guess most of you guys have seen it already. It was covered through many channels. But this was all the preparation of Harikrishna and also what we had together. Knight d6 check, king f8, king takes f2. Knight c6, and now bishop e3. And this is sort of the start here. White, of course, is a queen down for only 2 pieces. Black even has a pawn for that, but the knight on d6 is incredibly powerful, and black is having a hard time to develop the pieces. So practically speaking, the position is not so easy. And Najdorf immediately sort of went wrong with this queen b6 plan, because now the bishop on c8 is never really getting out, and so is the rook on a8. And Harikrishna won a really beautiful game. He did also some analysis on some other channels, so if you're curious about that, definitely check it out. I think he did an interview with Lee Chess, for example, too. Very, very beautiful game. Black's best, from what I recall, is queen c7, setting up a threat of knight takes e5, knight b5, queen a5, bishop d3, king g8, trying to get the king to safety, but still it's not so easy for black, all of that. Like, how do you get out this bishop on c8? In some cases, there were ideas with b5 or also something like this, b6, a5, but still, it all continues. Again, only 2 pieces, but the main challenge is going to be to keep the initiative going, probably not to exchange those bishops, but instead to take on f5 at the right moment. Again, an honorable mention. The line is super interesting, but of course, if you want to play that, you should also find something against d5, which is certainly a move which Black is going to play if they don't want to enter all of those crazy complications. All right, and that brings me to the next one. Now we have an idea in the English, played by Gabriel Sargsyan against Diptayan Ghosh. c4, e5, g3, c6, knight f3. Another move here is d4, also possible for white. And here, after d5, Sargsyan went for the move d3, which is already sort of rare if you compare it to the main line with cd5, queen d5, knight c2. This is one of the holy grails of this English variation. I actually did a course on this for modern chess. If you want to check it out, I'm probably gonna link that in the description down below. Since I won this autumn challenge from modern chess, I was able to make a final course where I gave a full repertoire in c4, e5 for the black side. But let's get back to this. Sargsyan played the move d3 here. Bishop c5 is sort of the established main line here. And now d takes e4. This is where it gets pretty rare. The main line is knight b3, bishop b4 check, but here white has not really been able to prove anything. Black is just very solid here with a nice control over the center and even some space advantage. But d takes e4 is emerging as a new trend, I believe. The first game which made me notice this was by Szymon Gumolas against Shant Sargsyan from the FIDE Grand Swiss in Samarkand. And I can imagine that this is also how Sargsyan learned of the line, especially since all of the Armenians are typically working together. And in that game, Sargsyan was in a lot of trouble against Gumolas. So I'm sure they noticed that it's quite difficult to play for black if you have never seen it before. The idea is bishop e3, protecting the knight on d4, knight f6, knight c3, queen e7. Now, important move h3, stopping the move knight g4, short castle, and now another very important move, queen c2. Because if you're not careful and play bishop g2, rook d8, it's very unpleasant to get rid of this pin. Maybe white is even in a lot of trouble already here, because bishop takes d4 could be a threat at the right moment, or just to increase the pressure, maybe with queen e5. So you don't want to allow that. Instead, queen c2, so to get ready that after rook d8, you can go for rook d1. And now all of the coordination is pretty nice. In the game between Gumolas and Sargsyan, knight a6 was played, bishop g2, rook d8, rook d1, queen e5, and here white was a little bit better, because the main thing in this line is always the pawn on e4, which tends to be quite weak and difficult to defend, and white has all of the pieces attacking it. In my course, I gave the move rook e8, bishop g2, h6, short castle, and now a5, which is quite difficult. Even I was not like 100% happy with that, but that's mostly to do that the line is quite difficult for black, in my opinion. The idea here was not to place the knight on d7, but instead to go to a6, from where it could have ideas to go to b4, or just to stay like this, maybe later on to c5, keeping up this diagonal for the bishop. Often the bishop went back to c7, but it's not an easy position for black to play, like, if I'm entirely honest. Also not for white, of course, but yeah. And black, like, if you don't know this, I'm not sure that it's so easy to play like this for black. I think you need to know this to go for this setup. It's also not the only way to play. Like, there were 2 correspondence games, I think, which also followed like this, or something along those lines. Let me actually quickly check how they played it here. Correspondence, where are you? Why is it always taking so long? Yeah, queen c2, there are a couple of correspondence games. Let me check. Queen c2, rook d8 was one of them, but I think what I wanted to mention was this. And rook e8, yeah. Exactly, with knight f8, yeah? This is exactly what I wanted to show you guys still. And this position also didn't feel so easy to me. Like, this is what the correspondence guys were doing, but I was not entirely happy with this when I was checking the course. Because white does have a lot of play on the queen side, and black doesn't really have a lot of play on the king side, as it typically would like to have. So in the game between Sargsyan and Ghosh, black played the move rook d8, rook d1, queen to e5, And now white actually had quite a nice tactical shot, which was not played in the game. Sicilian played bishop f4, which was still good, but here he had to follow it up with e3. Or he could repeat moves with bishop e3. He played knight b3, after which black was able to equalize. Still, Sicilian was able to win that game and advance to the next round. But yeah, e3 would have been strong here. An even stronger shot would have been here, this move knight f3, which I wanted to show you. And now black actually has some problems on the 8th rank. If he takes on d1, queen takes d1, and e takes f3 runs into queen d8 check, bishop f8, queen takes c8 with a large advantage for white. And if queen e7, white will get sort of a dream endgame here, because again, this pawn on e4 is maybe even going to be impossible to defend, because bishop g2 is coming, maybe g4, g5 at the right moment too. Maybe even king d2, king e3 can be considered. Looks very nice for white. So if you're playing the English, make sure to check this out. I think this is going to be emerging as a bigger trend. And well, if you're playing it from the black side, make sure to fully look at this and really try to understand the position. As I said, I had a look at this to try and stay flexible with the knight on b8, but not an easy position to play for sure. All right, let's move on to the next one. Just a quick one now. It was a game between Suleymanov and Van Foreest Jordan. A King's Indian for all of the King's Indian fans. I thought we would need at least one of them too. And Van Foreest went for this line with knight a6, short castle, e5, and now rook e1. This is actually one line which I'm giving in my King's Indian course, which is most likely going to be released at the end of this week. And funnily enough, Jordan played exactly the idea I'm giving in my course. So I'm going to show you a bit of that. And if you're curious about that, and if you like my direction, make sure to have a look at my King's Indian course. I'm probably going to make a separate video about that as well. Bishop e3 is obviously the main line. Now black typically goes queen e7 here, but rook e1 was played by Suleymanov. And here Jordan opted for this line with e takes d4, which is quite rare and never really had such a great reputation, but I think it's quite a nice practical deviation from some of the main lines. Also bishop g4 is often played. Yeah, bishop g4 I think nowadays is kind of one of the main moves here. But this was played by Jordan and is also my recommendation. Bishop f1 was played. f3 is one of the critical moves here too. But knight h5 is a nice practical try with ideas like queen h4 followed by bishop e5 when white needs to be quite precise not to get into trouble on the king side. So bishop f1 is another logical continuation, and now knight e6 is the whole idea. So black wants to exchange one pair of pieces, which white can immediately facilitate by taking on e6 and probably should go for that. That's probably the best. When my analysis continued with bishop takes e6, and here the important thing is that black is going to play h6, g5 in many of the variations, and then knight d7, bishop e5. This is what I had a deeper look at in my course too. If white moves the queen earlier, like we could even think about g5, and if bishop g3, knight h5. So white needs to be careful about those things. Knight c2 is played in most games in my online database here, but now b6 is quite powerful, which is not typically an idea which you have because it doesn't look like the bishop on b7 is doing anything. But the idea is then to follow it up with knight d7, and all of a sudden black will have ideas with f5, opening up the diagonal for the bishop on b7, or even queen h4 followed by bishop e5 once again with some attacking chances on the king side. So bishop e3 was played by Suleymanov though, but this is already an inaccuracy because now black can take on d4, white needs to take with the bishop. If queen takes d4, knight g4 looks pretty good for black because at least we're getting the bishop pair. Bishop takes d4 and now c5, and very quickly it went wrong for Suleymanov. He should have still now went bishop e3, but already here it starts to look pretty dangerous for white. Knight g4 comes, and if the bishop moves, bishop d4 is coming. Rook e2, bishop e6, hitting the pawn on c4, and then queen f6 is coming as well. This looks quite dangerous. Computer still says everything is okay here for white, but I wouldn't like to be in white's shoes here. Suleymanov took on f6. I was actually walking next past that game when I was still playing in the tournament, and already here it just looked like a King's Indian dream for black with this powerful dark squared bishop. Queen d2, bishop e6, rook a1, bishop e5. And black is doing very well. White played f4 here, and here, yeah, b5 came quite quickly, and Van Foreest managed to win quite a nice game. All right, let's move on to the final honorable mention, I believe. Let me check if there is going to be another one, but I don't think so. No, this is going to be the last one, guys, which actually was not from the World Cup, but since we had so many Italians, I wanted to show you guys another idea in the Italian. This was from the Kazakhstan tournament, which was also featured on my channel a couple of days ago. And this time Karthikeyan, who was also featured in the other video, but in more unfortunate circumstances, where he was checkmated in quite an unfortunate game in the Queen's Indian. If you want to check that out, it was just released a couple of days ago. But here in this Italian with d4, how do you call it? Scotch Gambit, I believe, yeah? d4, e takes d4, e5. Karthikeyan went for the move knight g4, which I never seriously checked, but it turns out that it's actually a very interesting alternative for black to the more established main lines d5 and knight e4. And yeah, it's a very healthy alternative for black, even though it does look a little bit strange. After short castle, and the funny thing is, black even has quite a lot of flexibility. Like here, d6 was the move played by Karthikeyan. It was against Kazibek Nogurbek, by the way, who was playing white, former world champion, former youth junior world champion from Kazakhstan. d6 was played by Karthikeyan, but bishop e7 also is quite interesting. After rook e1, bishop f4 is bad because of g5, by the way, when black is already better. Rook e1, d6, e takes d6. Black has both options. C takes d6 is possible, or queen takes d6. This was some correspondence game. White had to go for this b3 move here, probably, to get bishop a3, and it's sort of a straightforward equality as far as I could see. Like, there's just nothing happening here. So this seemed quite okay for black, just bishop e7 here. C takes d6 in this line is also possible. Even white can go wrong here quickly. After knight takes d4, bishop h4 is coming, bishop f6, and some ideas with queen b6. Artemiev played quite a nice game here from the black side. So yeah, bishop g5 might have been the best, but also this doesn't seem like it should be much of a problem for black. Rook d8 is coming, then queen f6. Some knight g4 ideas. Like, the line looks pretty healthy from what I could see. You typically don't see it that often because, of course, knight e4 and d5 are pretty good alternatives as well, but it could be something which also the white players are not necessarily expecting. Karthikeyan went d6 here, e takes d6, and again, queen takes d6 is possible here, and there are so many different alternatives, like even bishop e6 is possible here. I checked bishop e7, which is transposing to the line which we've seen earlier with the immediate bishop e7. But Karthikeyan went for this, which is probably the most enterprising way to play the variation. E takes d6, bishop d6, rook e1 check, and now king f8. And I tried to understand what white should probably do here. In the game, Nogurbek went for c3, after which black had very easy equality, maybe even slightly more than that. Knight e5 was played, white did win back the pawn, but black has the bishop here. And absolutely nothing to worry about. Now bishop d5, another nice move. This doesn't work because of bishop h2. And here they settled on a draw, but if someone is better, it's probably black, just because of the powerful bishop on d5, but of course, drawing tendency is quite high, but if I would pick someone, it's probably black here. So what should white do here after king f8? Probably the best move is knight d2. h3 is also logical, but I don't think that this was so critical. Now again, knight e5, if take on e5, queen takes d4 is never a problem because, well, here it's actually quite a nice tactical trick with knight f3. I wanted to say knight takes c4 is easy equality, which probably is also the case, but this actually wins nicely for black. And bishop b3, queen f6 is already quite comfortable as well. Again, white cannot regain the pawn because of this. And if knight d2, queen g6 with bishop takes h3 ideas. So white actually had to go for this move bishop d5 to try and play for something, because now if queen f6, knight d2 works, and queen g6, knight e4, and the bishop on d5 is protecting the g2 point, when now this is going to become obvious, and here black is in a lot of trouble. So c6 is important, and now white needs to go back to b3. I don't think anyone is going to find this on the board. Still, the position is playable, queen f6, queen g6, and yeah, it's quite complicated, but black is fine in the very end. This was one of my one of my variations here if you want to, in case you want to check it out a little bit further. This was, of course, incredibly complicated, but in the end, it went to some drawish endgame. So h3 is possible. Knight d2 is another line I've checked. Now knight e5, take on e5, bishop b3, not giving away the bishop here, and now bishop g4. Provoking f3 and going back to f5. Knight e4, and now h5 is a novelty which seems quite interesting and sort of important. h6 is also another possibility, just stopping bishop g5. And also here was some correspondence game, which, yeah, is complicated, but in the end worked out fine for black, because it's actually not so easy to win back the d3 pawn if bishop c4, knight e5 could be coming, for example. Or queen b6, of course. Queen b6, queen b2 is there too. Yeah, h5 was my analysis here. If now bishop g5, f6 comes, and then c5, and always if c3, d3. The idea of h5 is a little bit mysterious. Like in most cases, the point is to go king g8 and then to have king h7 in some of the lines. It will become obvious now. If bishop f4, knight c6, knight d6, c takes d6, now we can run with the king to h7. And it's actually not so easy for white to regain this pawn on d4, because like now also if c3, d3 comes, bishop c4, knight e5. And here black is actually better because we can take on c4. And this pawn on d3 is impossible to win back for white. Yeah, this was my main line here, bishop g5, then queen c7, and yeah, some position like this. Objectively balanced, but practically quite unbalanced, because white does have the bishop pair, but we have an extra pawn still. So this was, anyway, again, another honorable mention, but I think that knight g4 is quite an interesting line, which certainly can be investigated a bit further. So that was it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was quite a long one from the material and also from the preparation time. So if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, I would really appreciate it if you leave a comment and like the video. It really helps me out a lot. Apart from that, you can check out my courses in the video description down below. And that was it for today. Hope you enjoyed this final video about the World Cup. Again, it was a nice experience for me to be there as well, and to go through all of the games, to revisit some of the highlights is, I believe, quite a nice way to end the FIDE World Cup 2025 for this channel. So thank you guys for watching, and I'm going to see you guys soon.